This is a 2005 Maserati MC12, and it's one of the most amazing supercars from its era. This car is worth more than $3 million. Only 50 of these exist in the entire planet. It's powered by a massive V12, and this car is based on the Ferrari Enzo, except the MC12 is rarer and more special. And today I'm going to review the MC12 and show you all of its quirks and features. Before I get started, be sure to check out Cars and Bids, which is my enthusiast car auction website for cool cars from the modern era with free listings. You can list your cool car for free and auction it on Cars and Bids. And we've had some fantastic sales recently, including this wonderful Audi R8, which sold for over $122,000. This amazing BMW M5 E39 with low mileage brought $64,000. And this wonderful Mercedes AMG GTS sold for $68,000. These are becoming real bargains, and you can get one on Cars and Bids. If you're looking to buy or sell a cool enthusiast car from the modern era, Cars and Bids is the place. With daily auctions, great selection, and free listings, check it out at carsandbids.com. Before we get started, I should mention that I've borrowed this MC12 from CARETAKERS collection, which is a truly unbelievable collection of some of the most amazing cars in existence. And you can follow along with CARETAKERS collection by clicking the links in the description below. And you should, because, like I said, incredible cars, and they use them. Check out CARETAKERS collection with the links in the description. All right, time for the quirks and features of the Maserati MC12, or as I call it, the MiC-12. So let's talk about this car, starting with a general overview. This car shares its platform with the Ferrari Enzo. It shares its engine with the Ferrari Enzo. It was essentially an Enzo with a different body and some other changes. Basically, Maserati had a version of the Ferrari Enzo. You might be wondering, why exactly was this? Especially because Maserati is primarily known for least special sedans and SUVs. Why did they make a multi-million-dollar supercar? So here's the deal. The Enzo was coming out in the early 2000s, and Maserati wanted to get back into GT racing. They wanted to add a little bit more credibility to the brand, which they felt, correctly by the way, had devalued in the previous years. And they figured if they went GT racing and had some wins, it could show people that Maserati is a true performance brand with some racing credentials. Now, Ferrari was already building the Enzo. Maserati wanted a race car, so they figured, let's borrow that platform, that powertrain, and let's take it racing, which they did with an MC12 race car. But in order to compete in the GT racing class, they needed to build a production road version of their race car, and so they did. They made 50 of these MC12s, only 50 for the entire world, which boils down to basically 25 for the 2004 model year and another 25 for the 2005 model year. Plus, they made 12 total race cars for a complete production run of just 62 units for the entire planet of the Maserati MC12, including the race cars. That makes this a lot rarer than the Ferrari Enzo, which Ferrari said they built 400. Probably the real number is over 500, but regardless, it ain't 50. This thing is incredibly rare, one of just 50 road cars in the world. So let's talk quirks and features. Now, there is very little content in the world about this car on YouTube or anywhere else, mainly because, well, they only made 50, and also because it predates YouTube. So small production run before YouTube, there's just not all that much out there about this car. So I'm gonna be extra thorough in this video and show you as much as I possibly can, because you might not have too many other opportunities to see all the quirks and features of an MC12. So let's start with getting in. This is the key. There is no keyless entry, there is no remote, there is no trunk popper button. It is just a simple key. That's all you get. Adding keyless entry, etc., would have made the car heavier, unnecessary, so it doesn't have that. Now, one interesting thing when you're opening the door handle, which to me appears to be a regular Maserati coupe door handle, just made horizontal and flipped upside down. They took that door handle they were already making and they just stuck it on this car in a weird orientation. situation, and that's it. Doesn't exactly have a special supercar door handle, but a door handle nonetheless. You pull on it and then the door opens up. And one thing you'll notice quickly is the door opens normally, just like a regular car door. Now this is notable because the Enzo had butterfly doors that opened upwards, whereas the MC12 just has standard regular car doors, which made it seem a little bit more pedestrian, but trust me, it is not. Now, on the inside of the MC12 door panel, you can see a couple interesting things. For one, power windows. The Enzo did not have power windows. It had a manual window on a weird circular track that was very strange. The MC12 has power windows. Despite being the race car-y version, it added that luxury. It also has a little net in the door panel for storage. You can store your wallet there, paperwork, whatever you might want. Again, the Enzo didn't have that, just a simple carbon fiber door panel. If it had a net there, when you opened the door, stuff would have fallen out. So the Enzo was a little bit more basic in the door panel situation. Now, next up, another major difference between this and the Enzo, aside from the bodywork, the door opening, was the roof. All Enzos were coupes with a fixed roof. The MC12 looks like a coupe, but in fact, it is a targa. This is a targa roof, which means it can be removed. You can take this off and enjoy this glorious car with the sun and the wind in your hair as you drive along. So to remove this roof, there's a couple of latches on the inside. You just pull the latches down and then it's unlocked, and then you just pick up the roof and pull it out, and suddenly the car is open and it's a convertible. It is just that easy, and now you're enjoying the Enzo's glorious powertrain, but in a convertible, which was a big advantage of the MC12. But as cool as it is to have a removable roof in this car, it had one big drawback, and that was there's nowhere to put it. I'll go through this car's ridiculous lack of storage space in a minute, but for right now, understand that there's no place to put the roof when you pull it off. Not behind the seats, not in the front compartment, meaning if you took off the roof and drove the car, you had to just hope it was a sunny day and a rainstorm didn't come, because you wouldn't have a roof to put on. But anyway, since I'm inside the MC12, let's start talking about the interior. Now, all of the MC12 models had this same interior, which is this sort of blue color basically everywhere. This was, and kind of still is, Maserati's color. A lot of Maserati models at this time had blue trim or blue interiors in this color. It was kind of the special cool Maserati color, and they installed it on the MC12 as well. The seats, the dash, the steering wheel, as you can see, a lot of this blue. In addition to being Maserati's special color at this time, it also matched the exterior of this car. All 50 of the MC12 road cars were painted this white and blue color as well. I'll get back to the paint in a little bit, but just know that you had the white and blue on the outside and the matching blue on the inside, and that's how all of these came. But anyway, other items worth noting in the interior. I already showed you that this car has power windows and it had that door net, very luxurious and nice. Well, it doesn't have a rear window at all. There's none. And that means it doesn't have a rear view mirror either. So you can't really see that well behind you in this car, which is kind of a problem, and I'll cover that in more detail later as well. Another thing it doesn't have is a radio. There's no radio in this car. It was not available, and there's no real place to put it. You can see here in the center console, you don't even really have space for a radio. But then again, who needs a radio when the car sounds like this? Okay, so that makes up for not having a rear window or a radio. Sounds pretty amazing. And there were some other nice amenities in here. For instance, power mirrors. You can see the power mirror control down here, just like you might have in a Honda Civic. Well, the Maserati MC12 has it as well. You also had air conditioning. The primary thing in the center control stack here is the air conditioning controls, not just a fan, but actual air conditioning to keep you cool, which was a nice benefit. Now, another item worth pointing out, since we're talking about the center area of this car, is the transmission. You will notice no gear lever here in the center, and that's because this is an automatic. Just like the Ferrari Enzo, all MC12 models had an automatic transmission. Now, it was a sequential manual, which meant you had mechanical feel and paddle shifters stuck on the steering column, so it's not like a traditional torque converter automatic, which is slower, but it was an automatic nonetheless. Now, in the Enzo, they called this transmission F1, which is how Ferrari called all of its sequential manuals at the time. In the 360, the 430, it was all F1. In this car, they call it Cambio Corsa, which is the name that Maserati gave life to its sequential manual transmissions, but they are the same, the exact same transmission, except that this car has been dulled down just a little bit. It has a slightly lower red line than the Enzo, and the gear ratios have been changed a little bit so that it's not faster than the Enzo. But other than that, this car had the very same transmission, just called Cambio Corsa instead of F1. Now, one interesting difference in the interior of this car compared to the Enzo is that the center console of the MC12 has quite a few buttons in it, as you can see. There's several different buttons and controls in this center console. Compare that to the Enzo, and you'll notice only a couple of buttons and a little bit more like storage compartments. And the reason for that is the Enzo had more controls on its steering wheel. You'll notice the MC12 steering wheel is completely devoid of any controls at all. It has none, and all that stuff was buttons in the center. For example, reverse is this big R button here in the center on the MC12. You push that and you're in reverse. In the Enzo, reverse was a button on the steering wheel. You press that and then you were in reverse, a different way to do it. And another difference, the MC12 has the axle lifter button here in the center console. You can see a little race car with an arrow pointing up in the front. That's the axle lifter. In the Enzo, that button was also on the steering wheel. It had been moved to the wheel, and again, a different placement. And by the way, the axle lifter in this car is incredibly loud. Take a listen to the axle lifter doing its thing. Now, other buttons worth pointing out here in the center console, you have a few light controls here. So you have your fog lights here, as you can see, you have parking lights, and you have your hazard lights, all different buttons here in the center console in the MC12. Your other buttons here are race mode. You press that and you go into like a crazier drive mode, and ASR with a line through it, that will turn off your traction control. So if you really want to go crazy in this car, it's incredible value, and turn off everything, you can do that with these buttons right here in the center. Now, also worth pointing out here in the center of the MC12, two other very notable items. One is a clock. You had a very nice upscale looking clock, which never really made sense to me in this car, which was a homologated race car, but you did have this analog clock here in the middle. I guess it tied into other Maserati models, which also had a similar clock in the time period. You also have a start button here, although unfortunately you can't just get in the car and press it. This car came from that era in the early 2000s when they were just starting to experiment with start buttons, and you had to get in, stick the key in, twist it, and then you could press the start button, which kind of defeated the purpose of having a start button at all, except for the fact that, well, it was cool, and indeed it is. Now, you probably noticed that that start button was finished in the same Maserati blue as the interior and exterior, and speaking of color and trim in this interior, this car has one of the most bizarre trims I have ever seen in my entire life, and that would be this cloth on the dashboard, which is intended to look like carbon fiber, even though it is in fact cloth. You can see the carbon fiber right next to it. It sort of has a similar look to it, and they weren't trying to make it look just like carbon fiber, but they were trying to give the appearance of carbon fiber with cloth, which is so bizarre, but that's what they did. You have this cloth trimming all over the dashboard, cloth intended to look like carbon fiber. And by the way, you will also notice some of this carbon fiber cloth in the footwells, like in the center part of the footwell where your knee might hit. They've covered it in carbon fiber cloth to make things a little bit more comfortable. But next, let's move on to the gauge cluster, which is pretty cool in this car. The central gauge is a massive tachometer, just like it is in the Ferrari Enzo. The speedometer is confined over to a corner. The tach is what's really important. And on either side of the tach, you have on the left a Maserati logo, and on the right, V12, which just looks cool. I think this gauge cluster is very cool, very exciting, except for the font they've chosen, which is this odd italicized numbers, looks a little cartoonish, doesn't seem to fit with a multi-million-dollar limited production exotic car, but that's what the MC12 has. Feels a little early 2000s. Now, also worth noting related to the gauge cluster, to the left of the gauge cluster in the steering wheel, you have these two little unlabeled black circular buttons. These will adjust the trip odometer. You can use it to set the clock, that kind of thing. Sort of secret buttons, but that's what they do. Pretty simple, actually. The other other cool thing about this gauge cluster is the screen in the center. This car is old school. It had a pixelated screen, as you can see, but the cool part is that it shows the MC12 from the top down, and it's kind of a faithful representation of the MC12, just using only a few pixels. You can see exactly what it looks like from the top, but in pixels in the gauge cluster, and it would show you if a door was open or that kind of thing. The tech is obviously far behind anything you get in a modern car, but that's what Ferrari was using at the time, and it's kind of charming. But anyway, other notable items in this interior. To the left of the seat, you have the parking brake, and its operation is rather interesting. Right now, the parking brake is on, even though it's all the way down. And that's because you can put the parking brake on and then push it down, and then it's out of the way to make it easier for you to get in and out of the car. When you want to take the parking brake back off again, you pull it all the way up, then push the button, and then push it down, and that releases it. Makes it a little bit difficult to know whether it's on or off when it's down, but it does make it easier to get in or out of the car. Now, in this vicinity, you also have the seats, which have a couple of interesting quirks and features on their own. For one thing, they are very heavily bolstered. They're not like crazy carbon fiber racing seats where you can barely fit in them, but they're pretty heavily bolstered to keep you in place in hard turns. They're surprisingly comfortable, actually. Sitting in them is surprisingly nice, and they're trimmed in leather and more of that carbon fiber cloth, which is kind of a signature of this car. Nice seats. Now, you will notice on these seats, you don't have a traditional seat belt. You only have a racing harness. That was one of the reasons why this car was not allowed to be sold here in the United States, in North America. Having a racing harness doesn't conform to our regulations for a 3-point seat belt. And yes, what I just said is true. This car was never officially sold here in North America. All of the MC12 models that have come to the United States since this car came out are here under the show or display exemption for very historically significant cars like this one, but it was never officially sold here. Now, also on the subject of the seats, one interesting thing, the seat backs move forward. This isn't just one rigid seat like in some modern supercars and sports cars. If you pull up on this little latch at the front of the seat and then push the seat back forward, it will in fact fold forward, which gives you access to the area behind the seats. You can see two things back here. Number one, a lot more of this carbon fiber cloth. They really use that everywhere in this interior, but you will also see a little storage compartment back here. This is sort of between the seats, and it goes a little further than that. Nice to have this storage compartment because there is no glove box in this interior. In fact, there's no other storage at all except for the little nets on the doors and this little net between the seats. That's it. By the way, one other item you will notice in the vicinity of the driver's seat near the bottom of the seat back is this little button. What exactly is this? It's an inertia switch. So if you get into a crash in this car, it'll shut off its fuel pump to prevent a fire. It'll put on its hazard lights, disconnect stuff, and pressing that switch allows you to reset the inertia switch in case it gets tripped. Who knew? Little hidden button on the MC12. But anyway, next up, let's get back outside the MC12, where there is still a lot to say about this car, particularly about its size. This car is absolutely huge. It is 202.5 inches long, a massive figure. It makes it longer than a Chevy Tahoe, longer than a Hummer H2, which was new when this car came out. For Europeans watching, this car is 7 inches longer than a Volvo XC90. And in fact, it was 14 inches longer than the Volvo XC90 that was new when the MC12 was on sale. It is massively long, exceptionally huge, more than a foot longer than the Enzo, with which it shares everything but not size. And then you have the width. This car is 82.5 inches wide, including the mirrors, which is absolutely massive. It is up there with full-size pickup trucks and huge SUVs, an enormously, gargantuanly long and wide car. But although I'm careful to mention the MC12's width with its mirrors, you don't really have to say that. In every other car, the mirrors are by far the widest point. But in the MC12, the mirrors are only a little bit wider than the rear spoiler, which you can see is absolutely huge, hanging over the back of this car and stretching out several inches on both sides. To demonstrate just how large this rear wing is, I will now lie down in front of it, and you can measure the rear wing based on its size compared to me. Which is longer, you might be wondering? The answer is the wing. I'm 6'4" tall. The wing is 6'6" incredibly wide, and at the back of the car, which is a bit of a problem in a car with no rear window. You better hope you don't clip it on something, because you might. But when it comes to this car's size, basically everything is big back here. The rear overhang, the distance behind the rear wheels until the end of the bodywork, is huge. You can see absolutely massive space back here. And one thing I've always thought was funny about the MC12 is you can tell where the Enzo stopped. It has this line here. That's kind of the end of an Enzo. And then it continues on for like another 1.5 feet of just bodywork and giant wing to make the MC12. It really is absolutely huge in back. Now, if you asked Maserati, they would tell you they made this car so big for aerodynamic reasons. Like I said, this car was going to go racing, and so air had to flow over it in a certain way, which meant extending the body to make that possible. And in fact, the race car-ness of this vehicle can really especially be seen on the outside and from this angle, where you kind of see why there's no back window. You have this sloping rear end that has vents to keep the engine cool, and you have an air intake over the cockpit bringing air into the engine. You don't have space for a back window, and race cars don't really need back windows, and so the road car didn't get one either. Very race car-y. But with that said, having a back window would have been nice to compensate for this car's hugeness. And in fact, this car's hugeness ended up becoming a problem when it went racing. This car was so massive that it didn't comply with some race series regulations on size. Big surprise. And so they actually had to shorten it. Some of the Maserati MC12s are a certain length, and some are about 6 inches shorter in order to comply with racing regulations. This is one of the long cars, but they also homologated shorter cars as well. And apparently that 6 inches was taken out of the nose at the front of the car, and you can tell the difference between a shorty and a longy if they're next to each other. And then you have the engine. Glorious V12. Like I said, this same V12 from the Ferrari Enzo, the mighty supercar, although in the MC12 it's been detuned. The Enzo had around 650 horsepower. This was down to 620, and that combined with the changes in the transmission made sure that the MC12 wasn't faster than the Enzo. It was Ferrari's peak supercar at the time, and they couldn't have a Maserati being faster. It also helped that the MC12 was a little bit heavier. This was around 3,300 pounds, roughly 100 pounds heavier than the Enzo, largely due to the extra bodywork and the removable roof. They needed to add extra stiffening and rigidity, which added some weight. But let's talk powertrain. For one thing, it is beautiful. You have this gorgeous presentation with the air intake painted the same color as the car, the Maserati logo front and center, and then the Maserati script on the oil cap, which also looks beautiful. This engine, absolutely beautiful, gorgeous in here. And you also have inboard suspension, which is always cool to see, kind of a neat race car trick, and they've got it in the MC12 as well. A truly gorgeous engine bay back here to house a truly gorgeous and amazing engine. And if you're curious how you get back here, there's a little latch in the driver's door jamb. You can see it here. There's 2 latches actually. One is the fuel door, and you know which is which because the fuel door is the smaller of the 2. You pull that and the fuel door opens up, as you can see. The other latch is for the engine cover. You pull that and it unlatches, and then you have to lift it up and it'll stay put. Once these prop rods are stuck in place, they'll bounce the engine cover on top, and then you can service your MC12 or just stare at its beauty. But anyway, next we move on to the back of this car, where I want to talk about quirks and features beyond just its massive size, although I do want to discuss the size of the rear diffuser, which is absolutely huge. This carbon rear diffuser down here, one of the largest I have ever seen in any car. Amazing, massive, and very scary if you're driving over bumps. You don't want to take a chunk out of that. Now, in the back of this car, you can also see that there is no rear bumper back here. The bodywork just kind of stops like you'd expect on a race car, which is another reason this car couldn't have been certified to be sold new in the United States. You gotta have bumpers here. This car doesn't. Other interesting items in the back. I've always loved the Maserati script right at the very back of this car, letting you know what it is, very special. You also have tremendously small rear lighting, which I've always thought was kind of interesting. This car is so massive, so huge, so wide, and the lights are these tiny little things stuck in the corners. But the reason they're stuck in the corners is this huge rear grille, which is necessary for cooling. Massive grille to help cool a massive engine, and so that takes priority over little pittance things like lighting. And next up on the subject of lighting, let's talk about the front lights, which are also unusually small. Again, for such a massive car, you have small lighting in back and up front. And these front lights aren't under a cover, which is odd. They look like they would be. A lot of cars with an aerodynamic shape like this keep the lights under a cover, but not here. They're just exposed. You can tap them if you want. Kind of interesting. In the Enzo, they were covered. Next up, a notable item on the outside of the MC12, the wheels. You have center lock wheels on this car, just like you do on race cars and some other high-dollar supercars. No lug nuts, just one big center lock, and you got different colors. Over on the right, you have blue center locks, and on the left, you have red center locks, so you knew which was which when you were sticking it back on the car. And speaking of colors, like I said earlier, all 50 MC12 road cars were painted in this color scheme, which is white with blue accents all throughout. Now, I say all 50 were in this color, that's what Maserati said, but I've seen pictures of a few that are not this color. Not sure if they were customized or painted later, but Maserati said they would make all 50 in this color. Now, the color scheme is intended to pay tribute to the Maserati Birdcage, which was a historical Maserati race car from the 1950s, 1960s. And so to create that tie with racing, since this car also went racing, they decided to go for a similar color scheme. Also worth pointing out, this car is not just white, but rather a beautiful pearl white that looks fantastic. Haven't really seen this color in other cars. I've always loved how it looked in the MC12. Absolutely a beautiful color that really fits this car well. And in terms of colors on the outside, you will also notice little flag right here. This is the Italian flag. No surprise, Maserati is an Italian brand. Race cars often have flags on the outside, and so the road version, they figured why not, and they stuck a flag on both front fenders, which has always been kind of a cool touch of the MC12. The only thing that breaks up the blue-white color scheme. Now, also worth noting, you will see directly behind the front wheels, you have this little grate, almost like a vent or an opening. I'm not exactly sure what purpose it has, something for aero, but you'll also see it kicks up a lot of stuff into these panels on the side of the car. I drove the MC12 earlier for maybe 10 or 15 minutes tops, and all of this stuff is a result of that drive. Maybe a little bit of a design flaw of this car, but then again, it's probably not used all that often. Now, also worth pointing out, since I'm up here, that the front end of this car has no storage. I mentioned earlier this car has an incredible lack of storage space or practicality, and indeed there is no front trunk in this car. Despite a massive front end, no storage at all in here. In fact, this front panel isn't really even intended to be removed. It's not hinged like in a lot of other cars where it just flips forward and then you can add stuff. Instead, it's clipped on with these little clips on the side, as you can see, and if you want to take it off, you have to remove the entire panel, basically an entire body panel coming off, and that is a multi-person job. 2 or maybe even 4 people to get this panel off. And the owner of this car told me it also involves detaching wires, removing stuff. It's not something you're going to be doing frequently, and there's no storage in there, even if you could, adding to this car's massive impracticality. And another addition is the front overhang, which is absolutely enormous, just like in back. The distance between the front wheel and tire to the very front of this car is huge. It makes sense that it had an axle lifter like I showed you earlier, a massive, massive front overhang, which fits in a massive car. Now, one other big thing up front, the wiper. This car has one single wiper, and it is huge in order to cover the entire surface area of the windshield. A huge wiper for a huge car. It all seems to make sense. Now, one other thing I do want to point out about the MC12, Maserati took this car and they wanted to go racing. And apparently that wasn't just for marketing purposes, because this car was tremendously successful in GT class racing. I think it raced from like 2005 to 2009 or 10 or even 11, and it won several manufacturers championships. It was a very dominant car for several of those years, very fast, very powerful, and a very successful race car. Then here's the road version. All right, driving the MC12. Oh my God. In terms of terrifying experiences, this is up there with the very most terrifying. This car is among the most valuable I've ever reviewed, probably 3 to 4 million in today's market, maybe even a little bit higher. Incredibly rare, and it's essentially a Ferrari Enzo. Now, years ago, I reviewed the Ferrari Enzo, and I was told that I could drive it, and when I showed up to film it, they bailed on me. They said, you can't drive it, but you can still film it. I did the review anyway, but I didn't get to drive it, so this is my return in the Enzo, except it's actually an MC12. But I can knock out both of them at once. I can tell you how they both feel. All right, so first thing you notice in this car, you don't have a back window or a rear view mirror, as I mentioned. This is a little bit of a problem because I'm driving a $4 million car that's longer than a Suburban, or basically the same length as a Suburban, and it could really use some extra visibility so I don't damage it. Now, one incredible thing that is clear instantly when driving this car, it's actually pretty drivable. It's comfortable in here. I have decent space, decent room, and just at low speeds, it's not so bad. A lot of these cars at low speeds are kind of nightmares to operate. This one isn't. Light steering, other than the visibility issue, it's smooth, it's nice. I'm actually kind of surprised. It feels drivable. Now, one thing I want to mention, 15 years ago, I lived in Atlanta, and a guy there had bought one of these and used it on the street, and I got to see this car driving around, and it was one of the most unbelievable experiences of my entire life. And I have never seen one again because they don't exist. And so it's incredible to be able to see this one here. Wow. Oh. Wow, that's a sound! The thing about this car is nobody talks about this car because nobody's ever seen one. There's only 50 of them. They basically don't exist. And people instead talk about the Enzo because Ferrari has a better rep, because they're more common, and because it was smaller and more theoretically tossable. But this car is an Enzo, except rarer, and I've always thought much better looking. And it's just cool. I'll tell you, something truly amazing about this car, I cannot believe how relatively easy this vehicle is to drive. It's just incredible. I was expecting it to be totally compromised and insane. I was recently in the Jaguar XJR15. That was a cool car, but ultimately a race car and kind of compromised. I was in an F40 recently. Wow, this is great. This car doesn't suck. And more than that, it's actually pretty fun. It's interesting because you think about some of these cars and you really start to think about, okay, well, it's not usable. I can't actually enjoy it, drive it, etc. This doesn't feel like that. Aside from the window situation, the mirror situation, this car is like fun. It's like easy and simple. I got a lot of room in here, which I'm stunned by. It's relatively comfortable. The ride isn't so bad. The mirrors stick out far enough that I can see on the sides of me at least. And like low speed maneuvering and driving is easy. Good assistance in the steering, feels fine. Now nobody's like freaking out right now, and I'm not expecting them to. Nobody knows what this is, but I'm freaking out. I'm astonished by this car. I think it's so cool. Now, I'm not really gonna be able to take it on crazy roads or a racetrack or anything like that. I'm just kind of driving it up and down like a 40, 50 mile an hour street, and I can do that, and that's fun. But it's just, that in itself is kind of interesting. That's how most people actually use vehicles, and this one is good. I'm gonna do one more pass here. Oh. Woo-hoo! Wow, wow, it's really fast. Now, one drawback of this car is and was the transmission. People complained about it then, that it has this sequential manual that's tough. You press it, it takes a second, and that is definitely true. It's not incredibly fast. One interesting thing is the sequential manual transmission has kind of, in my mind, over the last few years, become cool and desirable again. It feels very mechanical, and I kind of like that, as opposed to modern cars with their dual clutches that are just so damn fast that it takes out some of the emotion and the rawness of the car. It's not as quick, but you also know this car is not going to be as quick because it's an older supercar. So having the mechanical feel is kind of neat. Honestly, I'm really impressed with this car. I'm really impressed with the way it drives. I can't believe it's not more uncomfortable and more difficult. This car is surprisingly kind of a sweetheart to drive. Wow, it's so fast. It still feels super fast. This is awesome. This car is amazing. I would love to be able to get it out and really flog it, but that's not gonna happen today. But just driving it and kind of feeling it, it's really not as compromised as I was expecting, and it's just awesome. It's an absolutely kind of blast car to drive. I really thought I'd be anxious. Every time I get into a car that's worth $2, $3, $4 million, they're separated into two categories. The ones that are hard to drive and I'm nervous, or the ones that make it easy and I'm not. And this, unbelievable to me, falls into that second camp. I'm not nervous. It feels great. I just can't believe it. This car doesn't suck is the answer. It's fast, it's fun, it feels mechanical, but it doesn't beat you up. I like this car, and I really thought that I would kind of think it was just an oversized, ridiculous vehicle, and I'd be nervous the whole time driving it, but that is not the case. It is shockingly drivable and comfortable and kind of cool and nice. I'm not advocating driving this car everywhere, but it's neat. It's definitely a cool car, and it's definitely a more usable car than I was expecting. And so that's the 2005 Maserati MC12, one of the most amazing supercars of its day. You are unlikely to ever encounter one of these anywhere, on the road, at an event, anywhere. But in case you do, now you know all of its quirks and features. Anyway, now it's time to give the MC12 a Doug score. And the Doug score is here, 68 out of 100, which places the MC12 here against other supercars, including many from its era. I loved the MC12. It's more engaging to drive than I expected, it's gorgeous, and it's just ultra cool. Unfortunately, size is a bit of a limitation, and the value and rarity only adds to the difficulty of actually using this car. Still, the MC12 is awesome, better than I expected, and maybe the coolest Ferrari Enzo.